I'm Lindsay Brandon Hunter. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Theater and Dance. Some of you have heard a couple parts of this talk, that's the title, at previous CII events, but there's some new stuff. And I'll be honest, I wasn't quite sure who the audience would be. So some of this talk is keyed to like other people in my field, and I've tried to offer some sidebars during those parts where I can explain some of the things that might be closer to common knowledge inside theater studies and performance studies, but they might not be for everybody. But there'll be also time in the Q&A for me to go back to anything that went by too fast or that felt a little confusing. So if you want to take a note and ask me about that stuff at the end, I would be really grateful for that. How is the volume? Can you guys hear me and understand me okay? All right, sounds good. I'd like to thank the CII for hosting me, and especially Cynthia and my friend in the back for our help getting all of the technology sorted. And also, there are access copies of the talk, so printed copies here on the table if it's helpful for you to read along as I talk. If you want one, please go grab one. My only request is that they make their way back to the table at the end because they're not ready to be distributed or cited yet. Make sense? Yeah, okay. Okay, so let's start. There's a viral video from 2018 that's gotten some play as an explainer that introduces the concept of deepfakes, which we can think of for today as video that looks like a recording of live action, but is actually a synthetic video created with software tools powered by AI. And to be sure, this kind of media object doesn't often need the kind of introduction today that it did 7 years ago. But how deepfakes were described and introduced when they were more novel is perhaps instructive when it comes to parsing our fears and anxieties about the potential of AI-generated media to dupe and deceive. And because my hosts have been generous with me, I'm actually just going to play this video for you. Some of you came in while it was running. If audio description of visual content is helpful for you, just know that there's some description of moments from the video incorporated throughout the talk.
We're entering an era in which our enemies can make it look like anyone is saying anything at any point in time, even if they would never say those things. So, for instance, they could have me say things like, I don't know, Killmonger was right, or Ben Carson is in the sunken place, or, how about this, simply, President Trump is a total and complete dipshit. Now, you see, I would never say these things, at least not in a public address, but someone else would. Someone like Jordan Peele. This is a dangerous time. Moving forward, we need to be more vigilant with what we trust from the internet. That's a time when we need to rely on trusted news sources. It may sound basic, but how we move forward in the age of information is going to be the difference between whether we survive or whether we become some kind of fucked up dystopia. Thank you, and stay woke, bitches.
All right, so again, the existence of deepfaked video probably doesn't shock today the way it might have when this video was produced. Again, this is 2018. But deepfakes as a phenomenon retain an association with fraudulence and dissembling. And terrifyingly, schoolyard insults directed at Donald Trump's person probably seem less dangerous, or seemed less dangerous then than they do today. But if you didn't see the video when it came out, you might have read about it. My colleague at UB, Mark Shepard, references it in a chapter in his 2022 book, There Are No Facts. And also, my colleague in the discipline of theater and performance studies, John Fletcher, also made use of it at the beginning of an article explicitly directed to other performance scholars, so people like me, intending to sound an alarm over deepfakes' potential for deception and the responsibility of those of us who study performance, the responsibility we might have to deal with them as a phenomenon. Shepard describes that video as a deepfake from the get-go and renders a relatively brief sketch of its content, noting that the video, conceived as a form of public service announcement, endeavored to call attention to the capacity of this technology to manipulate the media landscape and warn viewers about trusting the content that they encounter online. Fletcher, more theatrically, instead walks the reader through a process of discovery, from naivete to savviness, one that mimics the trajectory of the video itself. He first describes the video in terms of what it might initially seem to be. In his words, nothing more than bog-standard Obama, the weary but patient explainer set against a typic background of American flags and Oval Office furniture, gazing into the camera and making a PSA. Fletcher attends to the speaker's affect and habits of speech in ways one might expect a performance scholar to do. Attention to these conventional aspects of performance emphasizes the video's very close approximation of what it masquerades as being. It isn't until the third paragraph of this description that Fletcher identifies it unambiguously as a fake, a reveal that emphasizes its potential to mislead and therefore its danger. And danger, in fact, is emphasized throughout the article. Later, Fletcher suggests that performance scholars in particular will need to, this is a quote, brace for impact in response to the threat that deepfake videos represent. He articulates with clear alarm that anyone with a sufficiently powerful laptop can, right now, today, it was 2018, but sure, fabricate videos practically indistinguishable from authentic documentation. He writes that we, and he means people like him and me, will need to revisit what we mean by critical thinking and critical spectatorship in the face of ever more cleverly manipulated and counterfeited texts, sights, and sounds.
We're
Play it again. Here we go. In the same year, so 2018, the conceptual artist, no, it's not good. The conceptual artist Gillian Wearing used a similar application of AI in a film that she made in collaboration with the London ad agency White & Kennedy. In that film, which is titled WearingGillian, and a cunning kind of pun on her name, she hired a number of people to play her in a video project while, as it's described in the film, wearing a digital AI mask of Wearing's face so that the participants would appear as avatars of her. The film itself is 5 minutes long, but I'm going to play you just a 30-second trailer that was created for its showing at a Cincinnati Art Museum exhibition. And same thing, I'll describe some of the visual moments later in the talk.
Hi, I'm Gillian Wearing. I'm an artist. Watching me being me alienates me from me.
And I don't recognize myself.
That's why I placed an advert online looking for people who'd want to be me in this film. Here are the performers selected and casting to be me. They will be wearing an AI digital mask of my face.
I'm wearing one now.
There we go. All right. So in that film, just like in the trailer, while all the speaking figures appear with a version of Wearing's countenance, the artist's face, bodily appearance, and voice are blended with other likenesses in most of the figures such that their gender, ethnicity, accent, and other attributes differ from what the audience is given to understand as Wearing's own. Their appearance is cunningly hybrid. One figure, though, appears and sounds like an unadulterated Gillian Wearing. It's the first one to appear wearing a pink dress with a green sweater. This is a picture of her. And she's the main speaker of the film's first lines. Hi, I'm Gillian Wearing. I'm an artist. And as an artist, Gillian Wearing has been making fakes for a long time. I'm going to show you some examples from her family album series of photographs, in which Wearing crafted intricate silicone masks, along with other elements familiar from theatrical practice, like wigs and makeup and lighting, a set, careful staging, effectively transformed her likeness into another's inside a carefully constructed photograph designed to mimic or recreate a family photo with herself as the disguised subject. This is Self-Portrait as My Grandmother, Nancy Gregory, which looks like a studio portrait of a dark-haired white woman from the 1930s-ish, I'm guessing. but is actually a carefully staged contemporary photograph of Gillian Wearing, produced in 2006, wearing a very detailed mask and exactingly staged. The curator, Jennifer Blessing, describes it as an impeccable simulation, presumably both of a period photograph and, via the logic of the photograph, of Wearing's grandmother herself. This other one is Self-Portrait as My Brother Richard Wearing from 2003. It appears to show a candid snapshot of a young man in his 20s, shirtless, brushing his long hair in a messy bedroom, but it too is Gillian Wearing in a mask. This is a larger mask that covers the artist's entire torso. I know. And this is Portrait of Myself at 3 years old. This is one of my favorite ones, from 2004. It looks like a mid-20th century black and white studio portrait of a young child, but in the image, the mask of a cherubic baby face has been applied to the adult-sized head of a roughly 40-year-old Gillian Wearing. So that's her inside the mask. So in slideshow, these mostly look like the actual quotidian photos that they're so painstakingly staged to resemble, so much so that they risk, in their success, appearing unremarkable. But in the gallery, many of these photos are large format, and when they're seen at size, their effect is considerable. They are amazing achievements of likeness, in which Wearing uses emphatically analog means to work with, to enact what might be called alternately masquerade, deception, disguise, or self-portraiture. In the catalog for Wearing's 2021 retrospective at the Guggenheim, Blessing suggests that Wearing's work, including these painstakingly executed self-portraits in which she masquerades as others, proceeds less from an interest in deceiving and more from an interest in deception itself as metaphor, a metaphor for the truth claims implied by documentary photography and portraiture and by notions of fixed identity itself. What Blessing is calling deception, and I sort of cheekily called fakes, are employed in service to Wearing's enduring preoccupations with the concealment, revelation, and flux of identity and selfhood, which is one thing that links it to theatrical performance, where perception of a person or a thing is never necessarily an absolute index of its identity or its ontology. For example, the actor you see on stage playing Hamlet is not Hamlet, although, as Richard Schechner famously put it, they are also not Hamlet. An apple you see on stage might be an apple, or it might be a piece of carved and painted foam. A spoon you see on stage probably is a spoon, but it's not the specific spoon it's pretending to be. In the same way that a kiss on stage is usually a kiss, and a slap might be a slap, or it might be an illusion of a slap, although a punch is definitely not a punch. In all of these cases, theater and its actions involve pretense even when they're real. Real actions and items and bodies, while also at the same time engaged in some kind of fakery. I'm thinking here of Michel Luc Carragher's satisfying and economical definition of theatricality and its promise as seeming to be one thing while being another. Theater isn't the only practice or form that engages that kind of pretense, but it is a pretty good framework for exploring it, given how often and how constitutively the theater prioritizes the business of seeming over the stark limitations of being. Blessing notes that prior to Gillian Wearing's later works that use digital means to help her and her performers appear differently, her earlier masked self-portraits achieved with literal silicone masks were staged theatrically. Those are Blessing's words. She emphasizes the theatricality of Wearing's earlier work explicitly as a way of implying contrast between its analog techniques and materials and the artist's later occasional engagement with digital ones, like in the film, which are tempting to read as primarily engagements with mediatized simulation, digital experiments that are far from the realm of the theatrical stage. However, it seems important to recognize that all of Wearing's work in this vein, in disguise, is theatrical. The digital AI-enabled WearingGillian no less than her work in silicone and wigs. It's the steady interest of deception as metaphor across different ways of working that makes Wearing's body of work such an interesting site for thinking about deepfakes. Or more broadly, the seeming affinity for deception that attaches so resiliently to generative AI, which appears often to be so threatening. Wearing's use of patently theatrical tools in her earlier career can render her later work with digital tools legible as employing a specifically theatrical devotion to artifice. That work moves pretty seamlessly from a self-evident theatricality to a digital one, all the while remaining invested in the same quite theatrical questions about deception and authenticity. The pursuit of her project across this range of methods and materials limns common ground between theater and simulation, which are often positioned as disparate enterprises, despite their shared interest in making compelling fakes. And in a sense, the Jordan Peele-Obama PSA also implies this common ground between theater and simulation. In the section when it positions Jordan Peele's own Obama impression, so like the embodied work of a performer, in a literal split screen alongside the technical marvel of AI-generated deepfake Obama. And I'm showing a still from that moment in the video because it's a move that quite succinctly highlights their shared theatricality, even while it offers Peele's organic, bodily produced vocal impression on one side of the split screen as a kind of artisanal work, and on the other, the product of AI as an alarming counterfeit, the kind that merits Fletcher's description of deepfakes as ever more cleverly manipulated and counterfeited sights and texts and sounds, which is a description that I have to admit reminds me a lot of the theater. That split screen differentiates between threatening and non-threatening constructed artifices. One given to viewers to understand as skill or achievement or art, one audiences presumably are well practiced in receiving and digesting and valorizing. The other is suggested by BuzzFeed and by Fletcher as an attempt at dissembling to which we might fall prey, a fraud against which we're exhorted to stay vigilant. And sure, right? It seems like the prospect of getting fooled about what is real can be very frightening indeed, especially when it comes to the products of generative AI, which are sometimes spectacular in their feats of synthetic verisimilitude. But concern about the ability of media to abet the duping of its audiences and users is also a very old refrain. From apocryphal stories of spectators fleeing the Lumiere brothers' cinematic image of an arriving train, to Peter Steiner's 1993 cartoon from The New Yorker, which jokes that on the internet nobody knows you're a dog, new media technologies are often figured as enabling shady activities like impersonation and piracy and fraud. Fletcher himself notes that, this is a quote, "Media falsification is hardly new. Humans do not require advanced technology to fool or be fooled, but that due to the scope, scale, and sophistication of the technology involved in generative AI, seeing is no longer believing." Without disputing valid concerns about scope and scale, and I would add like speed and regulation to that list, it's worth pointing out that it's worth pointing out the resonances between these fears and those that attend the adroitly problematized but still resilient notion of the docile and duped spectator of mass media, cinema and radio, and particularly television, which have been convincingly troubled by media theory, along with the tendency to understand media audiences as passive, homogeneous, and credulous. It's also worth asking whether seeing was ever believing when it comes to photographs, at least in those stark terms. Critical voices have long problematized the idea of photography and film and video as its sort of inheritors, as transparent authenticators of the real. But what I really want to point out is that those same humans Fletcher references don't in particular even need media of any sophistication or age to fool or be fooled, if that's what's happening when we encounter a compelling illusion. And we don't need recourse to startling new technological advancements achievements to ground long-standing anxieties about dissembling or counterfeiting or staging or the general insincerity of presenting a staged reality that obscures its artificial means of production. Because that, a staged reality that obscures its artificial means of production, is also theater. And without suggesting that fears around generative AI are reducible only to this, I offer that these anxieties about getting fooled are so accessible to us because they draw on a well-rehearsed and durable history of anti-theatrical prejudice. It's not a mic drop, I just need some water. So this is one of the parts where, when I talk to the people in my field, I say those words, right? Anti-theatrical prejudice. And the whole room knows what I mean. Or, I don't know, I think they do. And I realize that that might not be the same here. So I'm doing a little sidebar here to explain what I mean by anti-theatrical prejudice. And I meant to bring you my favorite book as a prop. I didn't bring it. There's this book that says in large letters on the front, The Anti-Theatrical Prejudice. It was published in 1982 by a theater historian named Jonas Barish. And his monograph chronicled the history of sort of the derogated position of theater through many histories and contexts. And rather than like do a lot of explaining, I'm just going to read you a tiny bit from its introduction that I think tells the story pretty well. He writes, "Most epithets derived from the arts are laudatory when applied to other arts or to life. If one describes a landscape as poetic or a man's struggle with adversity as epic or a woman's beauty as lyric," I don't love that one is using terms of praise. Similarly, terms like musical, symphonic, sculptural are nearly always eulogistic. They mean good things, right? But with infrequent exceptions, terms borrowed from the theater, theatrical, melodramatic, stagey, tend to be hostile or belittling. And so do a wide range of expressions drawn from theatrical activity expressly to convey disapproval. Acting, playing up to, putting on an act, putting on a performance, making a scene, making a spectacle of oneself, playing to the gallery, it goes on. Thespis, who gave his name to the art of acting, was called a liar because he was pretending to be someone else. And one would not be overstating the case by very much, Barish writes, to say that hostility to impersonation forms one of the cornerstones of Plato's Republic. So this guy, this historian, Jonas Barish, maintained that an anti-theatrical prejudice that he identified as being pervasive throughout historical contexts was not merely a Western phenomenon, although the history he draws is resolutely Eurocentric. And kind of as a result of that, it focuses on imitation and impersonation, which happens a lot in Western traditions of theater, as where the danger of theater inheres. That book was reissued last year with a new introduction by the inimitable theater historian Joseph Roach, who notes that in particular, it's theater's mimetic function, its reliance on impersonation and imitation, that invites the sturdy opprobrium that Barish chronicles across so many contexts and periods. Roach writes that to follow Barish's index entries for imitation, see also impersonation, mimicry, is to locate the thematic heart of the anti-theatrical prejudice, by which he means the book, but also implicitly the historical phenomenon that the book chronicles. And while the theater itself might seem like an attenuated cultural site in the current moment and not a dangerous one, it turns out that the threat posed by imitation, especially the kind that might fool you, can still be quite uncomfortable. Barish wrote that as the old hatred of the theater proper has ebbed, an underlying, and I love this phrase, an underlying ontological queasiness with pretending showmanship and insincerity continues to find subtler and more sophisticated channels of outlet. Without disregarding the real harms that generative AI might potentiate, and in fact, so we could better attend to them, we might do well to assess how much of the disapprobation surrounding generative AI is attached to that lingering queasiness. While it may not be the whole dilemma, concerns over the threat of the theatrical, of the fake, as inherently risky to us, seem likely to reside somewhere within anxieties that center so doggedly on the supposedly grave danger of being fooled by a convincing imitation. And as such, those anxieties vibrate at a temptingly familiar frequency, that of a deep suspicion of theatrical moves. After all, the purveyors of this new danger, against which we're called to remain vigilant, they trade not in, quote, the real truth of things, but in the disordered impressions of the senses, easily deceived by appearances. Those words are bearish, describing Socrates' critique of artists, and certainly theater people. In a contemporary moment, recognizable fears persist that the makers of frauds will, like Socrates feared that poets would, pour fuel on the most combustible part of our nature, inflaming our passions with their falsehoods rather than appealing to reason. The anxiety that attends generative AI's presumed falsity, and particularly its moral register, seems to me both so omnipresent and so diffuse and subterranean that it can be hard to locate or cite effectively. It also seems knitted together with admittedly related concerns about labor and work ethic and what it's tempting to call bad faith. To cite one example in which these kinds of feelings reveal themselves as commingled and difficult to disentangle, in October of 2023, the performance artist Karen Finley came to my university to give a talk about the culture wars of the 1980s and 90s. Karen Finley is an internationally known performance artist who has ties to Buffalo. Here's what I wrote in the speech. If you ever had to take theater history at school, if you ever end up taking theater history while you're here, and I hope that you do, you might find her name along with those of the artists John Fleck, Holly Hughes, and Tim Miller, who are known as the NEA4. They sued when the National Endowment for the Arts denied their grant proposals after they'd made it through a rigorous peer review process, specifically because those artists' work ran afoul of a decency clause adopted by the NEA in 1990 to uphold general standards of decency and respect for the diverse beliefs and values of the American public. There's actually a really good interview. It's on an ACLU webpage. You can Google for it, between Tim Miller and a journalist that kind of goes over what happened to the NEA4 in light of the current travails at the NEA. It's really good. Those four artists, whose works were provocative, sexually explicit, queer, feminist, Karen Finley in particular was known for her outrage over the AIDS crisis and the public response to it. They sued, and they were successful in lower courts, but in 1998, the Supreme Court upheld the NEA's decency standard. Karen Finley went on to have, and still has, a long and storied performance art career. She's known for visceral and provocative work, like her 1990s piece, We Keep Our Victims Ready, in which she adorned her nude body with chocolate in a performance of rage and anguish that confronted sexual violence and misogyny. Even the video, and it's a bad video from the 90s, watching it is like putting your hands in a meat grinder. It's amazing work. The talk that she gave at UB in 2023 was unsurprisingly about the culture wars of the late 20th century with which she's so indelibly associated. But in the Q&A after, someone asked her the question, sort of out of the blue, what do you think of AI? And to be clear, the question wasn't about deepfakes or even really about art, at least not specifically. But Finley intuited one meaning the question could have, and she had an answer right away, one that focused on generative AI. It's like a sex panic, she said. It's a new panic, the AI panic. And she described a faculty meeting at the art school where she teaches, in which she'd witnessed concerns about the use of generative AI tools by student artists. Anxieties that seemed urgent and reactive enough to merit description in terms of panic. Minutes earlier, she'd been speaking about the desire to police obscenity during the Jesse Helms era. And in addressing this question from the audience, Finley suggested this panic as a recognizable surveillant impulse on the part of gatekeepers to safeguard something like authenticity in much the same way US courts and lawmakers had once hoped to safeguard decency. At risk of turning Finley's faculty into handy strawmen, the story that she related does seem emblematic of a mode of response to the challenge that AI presents, one that risks conflating the overwhelming sense of foreboding that attends the rapid development and deployment and dodgy, insufficient regulation of artificial intelligence with a deep, practiced, easily mobilized antipathy that attaches specifically to generative AI's enabling of falsity and artifice. That kind of conflation is a danger in that it clouds certain real-world harms to which it seems harder to mobilize a response. For example, climate effects from the training and prodigious use of generative AI, or the theft of work and likenesses that populate the data sets on which it's trained, or the outsourcing to the global south of the underpaid data work that fuels most machine learning, the labeling, generating, annotating, and verifying of digital data by low-waged workers with few protections, a class of worker which the status quo relies on exploiting. The scholar Julian Posada has identified this as the coloniality of data work, through which historical patterns of power continue to define contemporary data production in extractive and damaging ways. So I am concerned that focusing primarily on a morally inflected anxiety about the fakeness of generative AI's products might obscure these other issues. But what I'm really here to argue today is that the ubiquity of that anxiety risks displacing these technologies' important theatrical potential, or even misreading that potential as itself the problem, when actually generative AI's falsity, its fakeness, might be the best thing about it. The potential for which I'm arguing is beautifully illustrated by Gillian Wearing's work. In that film, WearingGillian, unlike in the Obama PSA, there's no juxtaposition between a salutary, a healthy theatricality and a threatening, fraudulent deception, which her work recognizes as common investments in strategic presentation. Instead of distinguishing between the two, Wearing's navigation of disguise, identity, likeness, and how those elements triangulate each other into being is ongoing across novel and more familiar terrain. The artist exposes the dissimulative powers of deepfakes, not as an urgent threat against which audiences must inoculate themselves, but as tools that might help artists and audiences alike get at the weird unknowableness of identity and persona and self. Her work brings into practice another of Michelle Liu Carriger's observations about theatricality, that appearances' unsteady attachment to truth value in signification is not a reason to dismiss it as unworthy of study, or I would add, of use. In my favorite moment from the WearingGillian film, and you actually saw this in the trailer, but I'll refresh you. This figure of Wearing that appears to be unadulterated, the one in the pink dress and the green sweater, it's intercut with some of the other Gillian Wearings, and between them, they say a line that Blessing attributes to the artist herself. She says, "I do not like to be on this side of the camera, to be photographed. I'd much rather be on the other side of the camera. Watching me being me alienates me from me, and I don't recognize myself." Even though the figures saying it seem less than comfortable, that line seems to me to describe something truly exciting, something valuable about Wearing's work that she's often after: alienation of or from a known or knowable self, or from the construction of a reliable identity. There's something in it of theater's potential to make the familiar strange or special, or to force a perspective or engineer an effect using artifice, verisimilitude, or disingenuous appearance. Not long after that line about alienating me from me, that figure in the pink dress, the real Gillian Wearing, is revealed within the film as yet another artificially produced double. It turns out that the film's audience has probably, maybe, somewhat been fooled. But the revelation isn't a warning. Instead, Wearing's work relies on this potential for misapprehension and reminds us that a susceptible audience, one vulnerable to some fooling, is not necessarily exhibiting an existential weakness that will land them in a fucked up utopia, but may actually be participating in the precondition of susceptibility that makes theater and its way of producing experience and knowledge possible. As Gillian Wearing's work reminds us, and theater folks have long maintained, fakeness is a valuable methodology, one that can unacquaint us from ourselves and what we think we know. John Fletcher is right. When confronted with widespread new channels for fakery with which our students and ourselves appear to be enthralled, performance scholars and practitioners do have new responsibilities, but it's not to enforce bright lines that distinguish between the pure truth and derogated theatrics. It's to reach forward in curiosity towards what this instantiation of theatricality and the loaded popular and critical reaction to it is teaching us. Barish contended that our discomfort with insincere appearances, exemplified by persistent historical derogation of the theater, might be, in his words, a condition inseparable from our beings, one that seems to reflect something permanent about the way we think about ourselves and our lives. But what if generative AI's impeccable simulation could separate us from that condition, could alienate us from us? It probably already is, interrupting reflexive, habitual understandings of what images mean and how they function, maybe also holding potential to estrange us from epistemologies that relentlessly center human ingenuity and effort and judgment, even as we come to face the sobering implications of our own anthropocentrism. Generative AI might even throw into question a fear of theatrical fakeness that voices like Barish's suggested are so foundational as to seem indissoluble. That's it, we did it. Thanks. Do you guys want to talk a little bit? Yeah, Lori.
About, so what we're looking at right now,
yeah,
that is also a recruited participant who is showing us a version of Gillian Wearing. And another part of the question is, it looks kind of like a wig. What is happening here?
Yes.
Be wrong, but so I'm curious, were these people transformed theatrically the same way that she had transformed herself into her relatives? Or are we working with something here like the Obama video, where it's kind of like spoofed onto them visually?
Yeah. So I'm going to remember that there are three parts to this. The first one is that, so in her work, often the exacting nature of these silicone wigs that she made, the masks, which are crazy. Like, I feel like the pictures don't really show you in this format, like what they look like in the large format, like close up, or even poring over in the museum catalog. Like, they're just crazy, crazy realistic. Are often coupled with like really bad wigs. Like the wig, this is kind of a bad wig if you're into wigs, or even if you're not. And that's true throughout her work. Often the wigs are bad. And it's sort of this interesting juxtaposition of like, you know, super skill and then like, brr. So that's an old habit of hers. And you see it in the other folks. Like when they show that Brady Bunch kind of 9 up of all of the people, a lot of them seem to have weird wigs on, and like there are some theatrical elements at play. But what's really interesting about that film is that it's pretty opaque to the viewer, right? She does the thing where she shows you the digital AI mask, like it's just her face speaking on a white field, right? So the promise is that the transformation of the participants is done via an AI tool, but it's more complex, right? It's not clear which aspects of the people you're seeing are from their embodiment and which are from her, or which might be fabricated. It's just never quite clear. And so this picture, like, I don't know. I don't know how they made it. And that's kind of the deal, right? You don't get to know how they made it, because rather than an explainer that tries to tell you about how the technology works so that you can understand, metabolize, and avoid it, she's making it mysterious. But that's only 2, and you asked a third thing. Wigs, pink dress, I guess, and the other people. Okay. Did I get it all? All right. Yeah, Cynthia. Mm-hmm.
I saw that retrospective at the time, and the thing that jumped out at me, and I don't remember if it was, I think it was all of those. The masks are so intricate, but
Are you going to ask about the eye holes? I'm not ready to talk about the eye holes. Yeah, can I zoom this? You can see this one. I don't know if you can see it. If you can see this, one of the reasons this is my favorite one is that I have a bookmark that they sold at the gift shop that is just the eyes of this. And you can see the seam right here. So many, it doesn't seem to me, just like wigs. Not all the wigs are bad. Not all the eye holes are like this. But in this one, they really are. She makes these incredible masks, and then there's a purposeful gap in one place. And I leave the eye holes out of the talk so far because I'm worried that people are going to get rat-holed about the eye hole problem as like, see, it's not a deep fake because there's a tell, right? But what I would offer is that I don't, and you didn't say this, Cynthia, I'm just rehearsing my own agita about this, is that the eye hole isn't a tell so much as it's a complication in the same way the wig is, right? Because it's crazy how you cannot see the eye hole until you see it, and then you can't see anything else, yeah? And that's also, according to some of her, some folks who've written about her, like why the pictures are large format is so you can really both see and not see this like gappy place where she's clearly looking out at you in the midst of this incredible approximation. I think so, but I also think it's part of, I think it's less, like what I don't think it is sort of like, it's tempting to read it almost as a content note for the, or like a caretaking of the audience, like it's a mask. And instead, I think it might be something like, it has to be both, like she has to be looking out of it in some way for it to qualify as a self-portrait. And like this is the signal of her disinterest in making the transformation complete. It's not that she can't. It's that that's not the project. Yeah. Which is another way of saying that it's not the technology that's the problem, right? I could make this a flawless, an impeccable simulation if that were the project. It's not the project. The project is something else. Yeah.
Mine is about theatricality.
Rad.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. So So I read a ton of those 17th century, late 16th and 17th century anti-theatrical tracks, and they're incredible.
Like the Jeremy Collier and William Prynne and yeah.
John Reynolds, William Prynne,
Histeriomastics is the best one.
600-something pages of how much he hates the theater. He hates the theater. It's one of the queerest things I've ever seen in my life. If you take Shakespeare or early modern literature in the English department or early modern literature in various languages and literatures, you'll read this unhinged, just frothing hate of the theater. And their concerns are very tied up with, like, they're worried about queers, they're worried about sex workers, they're worried about classes mingling, they're very worried about actors performing like roles that of people of superior social status to them, like very politically dangerous to play the king in a play where the king gets killed. They're concerned that it will destabilize like the proper relations of power.
Yep.
Like it'll destabilize men over women, the king over everybody else.
Even gender roles.
Yeah, gender roles.
You know, there's a whole debate about whether female characters can be played by women.
Right.
Or they should be played by men, because they are worried about decency.
Right.
And what's more indecent?
Which is more
Males playing female characters or women on a stage?
So I need to look back at Barish, but it seems like there is a long tradition of like experiencing imitative performance as socially subversive. And
Yeah.
if you're mad about the socially subversive because you want the order of power to stay like it is, then you're anxious about imitative performance.
Yep.
So like totally, and yes, you have made me think so much about where that panic is surfacing in the cultural anxiety about AI. Right. Like that's what could make President Obama cuss and speak in like street vernacular. But there's this other like the theater is never completely socially subversive, right?
Yeah, that's true.
And like neither is the internet, God knows.
Yeah.
So like I guess I'm just wondering about like the politics of illusion. I'm genuinely confused. You have like given me so much to think about, because so much of that anti-theatrical anxiety is about the context. It's like if you're going to this dirty place to see this suspect thing being done, like you shouldn't go there to that location. Like it's a lot of like. So that's like a very different.
But the disapprobation isn't inside the proscenium only, right? Like those people are still abject when they, on their way home, like they're still.
Yeah, I guess I'm just having a hard time parsing out like what is anxiety about imitation itself as a form?
Yeah.
And what is anxiety about like consuming a particular kind of culture, which makes you one of the kinds of people that would consume that kind of culture?
So for the purposes of the talk, we're talking about imitation because I think it maps most easily onto this site, right? But you're absolutely right that anti-theatrical prejudice is not only about like shit being fake, right? It's not just about imitation. It's also about like even back to Plato, like he's talking about mobility as being the problem, that when things aren't what they're supposed to be, everything gets fucked up, right?
There's also this thing about you. I was really intrigued by your quote of the artist, I guess, watching me being me, alienates me from being me.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that provides an interesting bridge to this other side of anxiety around fakery, which is social media.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not here to defend social media or whatever, but there is this sense that in social media, we are both on one side of the camera and the other at the same time. Like we are curating our image actively, and we may feel like we are on both sides of the camera at the same time. And I wonder if that is also a good place to think about anxieties related to this notion of authenticity versus something else, whatever that something else is. And also the stranger in me. Am I more authentic on this side of the screen, or am I more authentic on that side of the screen?
Yeah.
On the screen itself.
Or is authenticity just a steaming pile?
Exactly.
Yeah. So that's what I think. But what's interesting to me about the prospect, I mean, that's a good question about whether like conceptions of the self are alienating. But what's interesting to me about that is that like this is the promise of social media, right? That it's some sort of blank slate in which you can curate yourself, right? Like you can create yourself. And yet it's being policed, influenced, and manipulated on all sides, right? Like it's being constructed by a powerful interest invested in an attention economy that prioritizes engagement. So what you're like, there's no freedom to be boring. There's no freedom to be forgotten. Like you can engage in social media on its own terms, or you can opt out. Which is not to say that there aren't resistant uses of it, but the idea that authenticity is on offer on any side of any divide in that situation is a construction of the people who created the platform in order to do what it does well, which is generate revenue. I don't know if that really answers your question. Yeah.
I don't know if any of you have been watching this thing about Boy From and Darshan, the other member of the boy band who's stuck in India.
I don't know what any of these things are.
Maybe some of the students would. It's really weird, but it's a send up of authenticity. I mean, it's just fascinating. It's a joyful. It's a put up. It's a send up. I don't know. It's about all this. I don't know how to reference it. I was hoping some of you would watch it. Well, look for it.
I'll find it.
YouTube.
What's it called?
Boy Crop. It's a make-believe boy band. That's the second choice name. The first choice name was Epstein's Angels, but they said, well, we don't want to be that. Look at it, because it's about all this in some way.
So when you say that it's like fake, like is it like, so are they like made up characters, or are there people behind them actually creating music?
No, they're real performers who are singing, and there's three of them. And there's a fourth member, Darshan, who's stuck in India, and they want to bring him over. He has a fantastic voice. It makes you want to go, oh, I gotta get Darshan here.
Connections in my head. One is the whole word masking is questioned.
Yeah, right.
Authenticity is in fact just BS. And the idea of autistic or neurodivergent.
Sure.
When you experience that, you do kind of think, well, I don't even know who I am.
So this is a
Authentically be me, but I
Sure,
which
yeah.
meaning you want, and which then in my head connected with
So this is a test.
Paul, who stated that you're born naked and everything else is drag.
Yeah.
So this is a test for my students right here. We talked about this in class. The word for person and its connection to what Cynthia was just talking about.
We're talking about persona?
Remember that? We talked about persona was connected etymologically to what? A mask.
Yep.
So that anxiety about, identity,
Right.
in connection to the mask has always been there from time immemorial.
And that's why theater is the first to social structure. Because if you realize that I can pretend to be nobility convincingly, then you realize that that's just a masked barrier, and they're no different from me. And maybe they don't have hereditary, innate differences that justify their presence, their recognizing more power.
Oh.
There is actually a play by Miguel de Cervantes about this. It's called Pedro de los Malas. It's about a roguish character. A rogue in that time in fictional works about rogues was an impersonator. And this rogue figures that he is going to be a theater producer and actor. That's the best way to be an impersonator and get paid for it. But a lot of it has to do with this notion of playing the king, as you said, whether that was subversive or not.
We could also talk about cultural mimesis, right? The mechanisms by which, for example, colonizers sort of present a colonizing culture as a mimetic object, as something that can be imitated. But if it can be imitated, that's also dangerous because it means that it's available and accessible to others. So the tension between whether something can be imitated successfully and what that means for the person who is being imitated is like maybe a core tension inside performance studies, where we think about performance not only as being theatrics, but also, if you know Irving Goffman's performance of the self in everyday life, like we perform not in a theatrical sense, but in the sense that we perform actions that define and constitute us all the time. When Judith Butler says our gender is performative, she doesn't mean that we get up every day and put on a costume, although she also kind of doesn't not mean that. She means that rather than thinking of gender as something that's inside you waiting to be expressed, it's a series of codes that you end up repeating until you are it, right? It's what begins to make you up. And the reason you have to keep repeating those codes is that there is no core inside that satisfactorily will like come out and become you.
I think I was trying to explain how I was going to word this. I think there was an overratedness almost, and how much value there is to be authentic in today's world sometimes. Like especially when it comes to like your persona, like online, or like even like how you go about, like I have a family member right now going through like job finding, and the whole goal of what he's trying to do is he's looking at what like the AI job finders are trying to like get out of, like, so that he gets to the next stage, so that an actual human's reading it. What is he gonna actually say once he gets in there, but it still like holds the value that he set to the AI in the first place? And third of all, like, I'm not talking about him specifically, but I'm just talking about like anyone, if they know like how to manipulate like an AI, like who's to say that like it could like manipulate the person themselves, because now the person sees, oh, okay, they were a green check mark to begin with. So I think there's like a lot of when people talk about like the use of AI, I think it also comes from us. Like there's not a lot of value sometimes in everyday life to be honest. Like, and I think that's why there's such a huge academic integrity problem, which was that if people actually cared about learning, then they wouldn't be using like AI. But they get the reward because they have an A on their assignment now because of AI, which they wouldn't have before. So they don't care about the process, they care about the reward. So I think like the outside view of like where AI is actually being implemented actually creates an environment where being less authentic is rewarded.
It seems like a great time for an artist who's interested in pointing out the ways identity doesn't really work, or is inherently flexible as well as being quite important, right? And what I mean about the ways that this work might estrange us from epistemologies that don't serve us, I mean, in part, like, maybe deepfakes are what interrupt the logic of photography as that kind of like authenticator of the real, which it's never really been, right? Like there's always been a process of context surrounding, like from Victorian ghost photography, right? How we look at photographs and how we understand them has always been an interactive, context-dependent mission. And maybe now we can think more about that in a different way. And similarly, maybe we can think about identity in some ways that are new and different, and maybe we can think about authorship in some ways that are adjusted. Like the thing about the ChatGPT and the assignment, I gave this talk once to a room full of academics, and David, you might have been there, where one of them had the courage to say, you know, I care about academic integrity, I care about my work, but I have to admit that when I get an assignment that's been, that I suspect has been produced by generative AI, my real anger is that I've been fooled. Like, I'm really worried about, did I get fooled or not? And the very first paper that a colleague of mine gave about what was then GPT-3, like he went through the process of how he trained his version of the language model to write what ended up being a pretty passable essay. And the thing that he described reminded me so much of the way I used to teach writing, which was to provide 3 or 4 models and ask my students to like kind of reproduce them and then see how well they did. And so I'm not suggesting that any part of this is like inherently right or wrong, but I do think that change at the epistemological level, like about how we make meaning or what we think guarantees knowledge, is probably the change that we're after, or the learning that we're after, as opposed to being able to catch people when they cheat, right? Does that make sense? Yeah.
Another interesting thing along the lines of what Sean just put on the table, when we think about what this is, large language models, we focus on the term model, and go back to your question. When we are coaching, PhD students to look for a job, we basically are doing, to a certain extent, what you're saying. We are telling them, okay, we're basically talking about the goals of performance for a job interview in whatever field it is. So it's kind of a performance, but it's also a model. The reference is a model. The more you can perform as close as possible to that model, the closer you can present yourself to that model of the perfect interviewee, we assume it's going to be what allows this person to have a leg up and getting the job. So, and it's not necessarily good or bad, because everything is about codes in our communication. Language is a code, and it's as you said, I think this dialectic of concealment and revelation is obviously part of language itself. I think this is a great opportunity. The fact that generative AI is out there, the fact that you have pointed out that the anxieties and where they may come from, is really a great opportunity for us to rethink a lot of these notions.
it might suggest to us that however savvy we think we are as an audience or a user or consumer of media, like those scripts about fake shit being dangerous are still really, they're really foundational for a lot of in a lot of cultural contexts that are still operative right now. And that, I guess, more than anything, like that's not a radical claim to say, like, I think that's happening and maybe we should check it out. But I think that is sort of the bumper sticker of this talk, is that as much as the theater isn't something to be afraid of anymore, I guess, we are pretty concerned about getting taken in, or you know what I mean? Like the apparatus that we have for distinguishing between like some act of fraud that visits a specific harm on someone and just the sort of general condition of fraudulence, which applies to all of us in some way, right, still carries a lot of weight. And that's the thing that I think is so interesting. Yeah, yeah. Oh, I thought you were, yes.
Famous dancers that I have looked up to over the years, like the image model that I wanted to kind of replicate,
Yeah.
but also kind of wanted to keep my own sense of authenticity whenever I went out on stage and competed and went for score and a placement. Like you want to be able to have that healthy balance of being you and having that sense of authenticity while still using things that you have learned from people who have worked so hard in the past to get to where they are today.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah. CII and I, CII is the other co-director of the Center for Information Integrity. We were asked to do podcasting by an organization out of Canada called Saving the World. And this particular episode...
Saving the world?
Saving the World.
Okay.
Nothing much. But this particular episode, they wanted to, it was about deepfakes.
Mm-hmm.
And the interviewer kept going back to precisely what you just said. Kept going back to, but all I want is to be able to tell if something is fake. You know, if I don't want to be taken in. I don't care if it's humorous or if it's this or that. I need to know that it's fake. And she kept going back to that. And the point that CII and I kind of tried to make at some point during the conversation was that it's kind of a point that has to do with fiction and theater, which is that you can lie with, you know, the relationship between fakery and truth is more complex than people think. That fiction, theater can speak truth, and also that the performance of authenticity can be deceived. You can lie with the truth. You can lie with an image that is altered depending on the context and how it's used. Can actually get into deeper truths, perhaps, than something that appears to be on its face transparent. And I think in a way, this is another opportunity to, you know, we hear a lot in the political vocabulary in particular, the word transparent is so often out there as you know, oftentimes, every time that I hear transparent, we're going to be transparent about this, what I hear is the opposite. Okay? Yeah. So there's another term there, transparent.
I just got me thinking about people being like transparent on social media and how like they can start to like kind of not like fake themselves, but they start creating this image on like social media to elevate themselves, and then it's like I would think like, oh, like yeah, this is social media me, but it's also real me, but then this is also me on the screen.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, well, which one am I? And I was like when disassociating, you're kind of like, whoa.
Yeah.
Like then you're like, okay, like I don't really know the real me, but I'm gonna keep doing both ones, or like both kind of like personas, but they're still both me.
Yeah. There was so I learned about this, the Gillian Wearing exhibition that was at the Cincinnati Art Museum happened before the retrospective at the Guggenheim. It was not a retrospective, it was only more recent works. And I didn't find out about it until it was finished. And I didn't get to go. But there was a piece of merch from that exhibition that was a tote bag that said, "You don't have to be yourself." And I've been trying to find this fucking tote bag since 2017. If any of you can find it, please call me. Because I find that to be such a refreshing sort of adjustment to the imperative to be yourself and know who that is, which, as Cynthia was saying earlier, like I have a very hard time with that. I don't really know what that is. And those categories, right? Like we do know when we feel lonely, right? Like we know when something about the mediated experience or something about the presentation of self is enforcing a kind of isolation. Like that's a felt reality. But the categories are, I mean, we made up those categories. They're words and they're permeable and like constructed, and they don't really always work very well. A lot of times there's spillover, there's holes. I mean, this metaphor is kind of falling apart, but I guess what I mean is I trust that feeling more than I trust rules or theories about how we can be ourselves. Does that make sense? Yeah. And I do really want that tote bag.
This is another metaphor that might be useful to some of you. Looking at that picture and hearing you talk about how that there's an imperfection there is kind of a...
The gap, yeah.
It makes me think of, in Islam, you're not supposed to depict Allah. And you're not supposed to, there's kind of a wariness about photography, representation, perfect representation. So in the Middle Ages, making carpets, weaving carpets, they're not figurative because of those prohibitions. But also when you weave a carpet, there has to be an imperfection. And that makes me think of regulating AI. If you wanted to regulate AI in some way, you might insist that there's always an imperfection. And if an imperfection can't be found, it's fake.
The watermark is an imperfection.
Yeah.
I have a curiosity from sort of a very like visceral place, because this image is really disturbing me. Just both visually.
Do you need me to shift it or?
It's okay.
Okay.
I think I can stay with it.
She's just a baby, Lori.
Like both visually and conceptually. Visually, well, conceptually because it's her being her. However many decades ago. But then visually, again, because of the eye, and I'm sort of just, I wanted to ask if you had any run-ins with like the concept of like the uncanny valley.
Yeah.
In this research, because I don't know nearly enough about it. I think that at some point it was like somewhat disproven as a concept, but it reminded me of when you were saying of this, like there's this human need to know if something is real or fake. And that's what is making me uncomfortable here, is that I want to know, and it could be a doll.
Yeah,
for all we know,
it
could be a doll that still has a mask on it. So it's just, yeah, oof, I don't know.
Do we have a human need to know what's fake? I mean, I'm trying to think about it, right? Like, there's times one of the caveats of this talk is I definitely care about whether there is a thing such as truth, right? Like, I want my vaccines to work. I would like, there are places where I definitely, like, so one of the limit cases for this work is revenge porn. Like, whenever I get on my hobby horse about like how great fake stuff is, I run it through that filter. I'm like, would I say what I'm saying if I was thinking about the circumstance in which someone was appropriating the work of a sex worker or someone else and putting a different face on it and like creating a lot of people's first experiences with deepfakes, and this is a rough reference just to give you a second, was Michelle Obama doing a striptease. It was a striptease, or was it a pornographic performance? I can't remember. It was one of the first like deepfakes with the guy who had the user handle deepfake like produced this, and it went all over the internet. And I think about that a lot because that stuff really matters to me. And I usually come back to some version of, right, there's a lot wrong in that scenario that is not that the video is fake, right? The fakeness or realness of the video is not so much the concern. How easy it is to make and how rapidly it circulates, yeah. But we also seem to miss talking about the culpability of rape culture and unregulated platforms when we talk about that. We seem to miss the topic of how we might care for one another. In our concern over, like, is it real or not? How can we keep people from making fake stuff? When really maybe our concern is, how can we stop violating each other so habitually and reflexively? Or how can we recognize the power structures that are already embedded in that act, that are amplified by new technologies but not created by them? And how can we recognize the places where we missed opportunities to do things differently, right? Is that a good place for us to end? Okay. I mean, we're not quite at 5. I'm reading some fatigue in the room, and I want to respect your time and brain power. But if folks have more questions, I'm absolutely happy to. Can I ask you guys some questions? Do any of you want to take a theater class? Do you have any questions about how, or a performance class in gender studies or English with my colleague Christine Varnado? If you do, feel free to talk to me afterwards, or you can email me. I'm lhunter@buffalo.edu. And I'd be happy to talk with you about how theater might fit into your curriculum, even if you're not a humanities student. We do a lot of arts classes that fulfill pathway requirements. We're always looking for people to come be part of the production work that we do. So if any of this conversations, the way that it engages theater is interesting to you, please come talk to us. We're not just, we don't just tap dance, although we do that too. We also talk about weighty issues and current events and stuff like that. Thank you so much for your kind time and attention. It's been really lovely to spend time with you today. Thank you.